Welcome here at Seismic Radio, and today talk on the Crusades. The Crusades, an act of love? That's the question. This is an article which has been, I've posted on godinanutshell.com, so you can read the article on www.godinanutshell.com. The question is whether the Crusades were an act of love. Now, when I look at the modern mindset and of spineless historians in the West, they consider this to be the darkest chapter in Christendom. Modern historians love to fornicate with the zeitgeist of political correctness and become highly apologetic upon this era in European history. Muslims love the term crusader. It's something they can rub in and mention all the time with utter disgust of, the West having done something terrible to the Muslim world by sending its knights and its soldiers to the Middle East. Now they always praise Saladin. Saladin is one of the greatest heroes who, after 150 years of successes and of establishing Christian rule in the Middle East, or re-establishing Christian rule in the Middle East, that he put an end to it. Now the problem when we look at the Crusades is that very often we look at historical events with modern eyes, with a modern mindset, and the next problem is that in our day and age we tend to believe the people who shout the loudest rather than analyzing historical facts and historical events in the context as they were happening. Now, the statement I'm making is the Crusades were justified and necessary. It was necessary for them to take place to protect the future of Europe. The call to arms by Pope Urban II and by Bernard of Clairvaux. Now, Bernard of Clairvaux was a cleric who was highly recognized. He was a monk and one of the biggest authorities of his day. Anyway, both of them did a call to arms. And very often Bernard Clairvaux, who is seen as quite an enlightened character, this is sort of put down as one of the darker things in his career of what he ever did. I tend to disagree, and I say it was one of the wisest things he did, and one of the things which had to be done at the time. And I don't believe that there is any question about it. So I don't believe modernist, secularist historians or even theologians who say that this is all wrong and it should have never happened. It had to happen. It had to happen. There was no question about it. Both of them this is for the First Crusade. It was about 1080, so it was about 400 years, a little bit more than 400 years after the Islamic conquest started. And when we look at the call to arms for the Crusades, the only point we could really make is why so late? Why didn't it happen a lot earlier? There were thousands, if not millions, of Christians who were getting slaughtered in Northern Africa, in the Middle East, who needed protection, who needed defense, and nobody cared for them. Nobody did anything about it for hundreds of years. And only then, in 1080, I think it was 1088 or something, round about those dates, the call to arms came and the Crusades began. If the Crusades had not taken place, there is a good chance that Sharia law would have graced the constitutions of Europe, and that our places of worship would be surrounded by minarets proclaiming the message of a different God under the threat of the sword. Now that Muslims love to forget when they shout Crusaders is the immense amount of blood they've shed in the Arabian Peninsula, later in North Africa, and throughout the Middle East, on behalf of the God who can only spread his message by his servants going on a killing spree. Now, the blood that was shed was mostly Christian. Europe was silently watching whilst 2/3 of Christianity at the time was ruthlessly slaughtered, enslaved, and turned into third-grade citizens who were exposed to a special tax, for furthering the cause of Islam if they survived, and if they were given the opportunity to pay this tax. Fortunately, in later years, there were enlightened caliphs who saw the value of having Christians in the empire because of the additional taxation they could impose, and they tended to leave them alone. So in some bizarre way, Muhammad established a rule which would ultimately protect Christians. But initially, especially in the days of conquest, of the Islamic conquest, there was pretty much the option of conversion or death. Many Christians, they would prefer to die than to follow this new God they were proclaiming. Weaker nominal Christians were converted to Islam by force. It is interesting to see that we are still waiting for an apology from the Islamic community for the bloodshed resulting in genocide committed to our brothers and sisters, whilst they never seem to stop demanding apologies from us for the Crusades. Now, it has to be said that in the Crusades there were a lot of things which weren't right and cannot be justified by any means whatsoever. And we need to acknowledge this as Christians as well. But then on the other side, we have Islamic hordes killing and committing genocide again and again and again. There was always an uproar, and it's something we are seeing right now as well in Syria and in other places, where Christians are beheaded en masse, and nobody says a word. I'm quite disgusted by some of the powerful nations in this country, in this world, who are okay to send millions of pounds or billions of dollars of troops to save a few oil wells, because that's what's important, money, commerce, and so on. And yet there are injustices happening. There are Christians getting slaughtered, and nothing is happening. No, the comment is made that there will be no groups on the ground. There will be no defense, which pretty much gives these guys impunity to go within their towns, which they control, and to murder people who are not willing to turn to Islam. And that's what we are seeing today. I'm not surprised. I mean, there's some rumors going around that the guy who's in charge of this and who makes those decisions of troops not to go there, that he is a Muslim himself, and he probably favors the death of Christians. I don't know whether this is true or not. There's a lot of testimony and there are a lot of witness reports who say that the guy is clearly a Muslim at the top of the chain of command, and his decisions pretty much reflect whatever's happening there. As I said, I'm disgusted by that. I'm not calling, this is not another call for a crusade, but it's just establishing some facts here. And then looking back on these guys going almost 1,000 years back who had something to fight for, and they went and did it. Now, let's have a little bit a look further of the whole issue about the Crusades. We've got an Islamic scholar who describes the difference between Christianity and Islam as follows. The spread of early Christianity was signified by persecution and dying for the name of Christ. This is pretty much the first 300 years of Christianity. This is what was happening. People were dying for the name of Christ. When we look at the spread of Islam, in contrast, it was signified through conquest and for people dying in jihad, which is in war, in the process of killing others for the advance of Islam. So that was pretty much what signified Islam. From the year 622 to the turn of the first millennium, it was a story of persecution of the biggest Christian community in the world at that time, which was based in North Africa and the Middle East. Almost all of the church fathers come from North Africa and underline this fact. Today, North Africa, other than Egypt, is almost 98% Islamic. Now, just to sort of go a little bit further into this, a lot of church fathers came from basically what is today the Islamic world. Almost all of them came from the Islamic world. There were quite a few from Minor Asia, which is Turkey today. And then obviously there are a lot of them which came from North Africa. So Christianity really was happening in North Africa, and population-wise, the majority of Christianity was based in those areas. So we're talking North Africa and then going all the way up to the Middle East, including Saudi Arabia as well. There were a lot of Christians there as well. Now, many of them died or were slaughtered or were put into servitude, became slaves, or were forced to convert to Islam. Despite the onslaught by the Islamic hordes in the Middle East, when they took a census in about 1900, about 20% of the population in the Middle East would describe themselves as being Christians. So we are not looking of a tiny minority, but there were Christian groups throughout the Middle East who would not bow down to Islam and stood their ground in their allegiance to Jesus Christ. And they were there till about 1900. And then due to pressure and ongoing persecution, many Christians escaped to Europe or to America in the 20th century. So it's reckoned that the current population of traditional Christians in the Middle East is estimated to be about 5%, in addition to an unknown figure of underground Christians who have converted to Islam due to divine revelation. There's some bizarre stuff happening at the moment in the Middle East. A lot of Muslims have visions of Jesus. Jesus appears to them in their dreams and they come to Christ just out of the blue, without any missionary input or any or anything really. It's just due to divine revelation to them. And it's really interesting as well. There have been many attempts to reach out to the Islamic world for at least the last 500 years, and most of them failed. Yeah, they didn't really get anywhere. It was just witnessing and testifying to people in the Middle East, and very few conversions, if any, could be noted. At the moment, it's just the other way around. The missionary effort has virtually disappeared to zero. There's very, very little. There's some missionary effort there, but missionaries on the ground are very few and little. And yet, people are coming to Christ right, left, and center in the Middle East. And we are talking right in the heartland of Saudi Arabia, of Iran, Iraq, Syria, and those places, Turkey as well. I met one woman who was a Muslim, a pilot, and she just heard from other pilots the gospel and decided to become a Christian. It's just really bizarre. It's things are happening there which never happened before. Okay, we've got a map here. If you listen to the radio broadcast, I quickly have to describe the map. This is the map of Islam at the turn of the millennium, roughly about the turn of the millennium. And what we see is all of North Africa has been turned to Islam. Then we've got Spain as well. Interestingly, Spain didn't really give up Christianity, and they stood their ground in not converting and in resisting the being proselytized forcefully. Then we've got Saudi Arabia. All of the Arab Peninsula was Islamized, and then we go into the Caucasus, right to Afghanistan, to Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, those areas. And then we've got, interestingly, not all of Turkey, but just the regions of Armenia and Georgia, where we find Armenia and Georgia today. And those regions were, again, forced to be put under Islamic control. Interesting as well, Armenia is a very strong Christian community, as is Georgia. And there are people groups who would not bow down to Islam. And this is something which has to be reckoned for. They've had pressure for years. Armenians, there was a genocide at the beginning of the last century. So we're looking somewhere between 1880s to 1915, 1920, where about 1.5 million, some figures say 2 million people were murdered in various ways. Interesting as well, it's something similar which was happening before. The Armenians, they lived around the Lake Van, and they were Christians. They were a Christian community, and they were heavily armed and to defend themselves, which was natural, because they were in a very hostile environment where they weren't liked, weren't loved on account of their confession for Christ, and they took out the right to arm themselves. They had some strike forces, so if any Armenian was murdered on account of his religion, they had a group who would secretly go out and defend those guys. So they were some sort of like assassins or something. It's a really interesting story if you ever have time to read about this. But that was a necessity, just to protect themselves and to protect their way of life and to protect what they stood for. And anyway, what happened is the Turks and the Kurds who were living in that area, they forced to disarm or encouraged the Armenians to disarm themselves. Once they had disarmed themselves, they were all gathered together, and then they were led to their death. There were certain death marches. In 1915, around about there was a Russian general just before the revolution who realized what was happening. They invaded Turkey and they rescued a lot of Armenians at the time. So if you say today that the Russians are all bad, the Armenians have to be grateful to them, at least for one stage, that they were rescued by them and defended by Russian forces. and hence I would imagine Armenia was incorporated later on into the Soviet Union. But anyway, there are a lot of parallels today. I know that in America there's like a heavy political agenda to disarm the populace, to disarm the people. I wonder what happens after they've all been disarmed, and what we'll see after that. Okay, just a thought on the side. Anyway, this is what was happening in the Middle East, and you can see the map. What we see is that 2/3 of the old Christian world had been Islamized. It just disappeared. All that was left was just a small strip of the Mediterranean. That's probably about a third of the Mediterranean, which was still under Christian control. And it was sort of getting less and less all the time. The north, by the way, the north of Europe at the time was sort of so-so. There were some Christians here and there, but there wasn't quite as strong as yet. Scandinavia came to Christianity quite late. The northern tribes of Germany, I would imagine it was very similar. But at the time, we're talking about the millennium, the heart of Christianity was pretty much the Mediterranean rim, and 2/3 of it was Islamized at the time of the Crusades. So, what should the Crusaders do? At the time, or what should the people at the time do? They knew that Islam, the concept of Islam, was conquest, and they were trying to fight in France. They were trying to get Italy from the north. Italy was in trouble from the east, and we got obviously the Eastern Christians as well in Constantinople and Byzance, and they were under threat as well. They were fearing for their status quo, for their lives, because these Arab hordes proclaiming a new god, and desecrating pretty much the God they believed in, Jesus Christ. Don't be fooled. The Jesus Christ which is in the Quran is not the same Jesus Christ which is in the Bible, and the God in the Quran cannot be compared with the Bible. To give you one fact, and I'm going to leave it at that, there's Muslims, they praise themselves on all the different names of God, the merciful, the this, the that, and the other. Not one name is love. God hasn't got the name love, whereas the New Testament is full of love. That's as far as God is concerned. God so much loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believes in him shall not perish, but have everlasting life. Love is the key in the New Testament. Quran doesn't know about this. Quran only knows about murder, killing, slaughtering, strange laws. That's what the Quran is about. Okay, right, we go further. At the turn of the first millennium, Europe was in trouble. 400 years, nothing had been done to protect Christians, and Islam was now encroaching on Europe. Historians have found evidence that Christians in the East were asking for help from their Western brothers to stem the threat to their lives and their freedom to follow Christ. So that's interesting as well. It's a fact which has never really been said. There were Christians, and there were Christians under Islamic control, and they were suffering. They were really suffering. And they were crying out for help, and nobody would come. You had these at times, united Arab armies and forces they couldn't withstand. And and it was just a horrible time. So people were asking, saying, please help us from these guys who want to kill us and to take away the most precious thing we have, which is our faith in Christ. In addition, holy places which define Christianity were in the hands of people who had very little respect for them. So we're looking at Israel, we're looking at Jerusalem. At the time, it was very important for Christians to do pilgrimages. It's a bit like today we go on a holiday to Spain, to Madeira, or if you're in America, you go to the Caribbean or somewhere. In those days, people went to do a pilgrimage once a year to get some time off, reflect on their lives, and enjoy themselves. For them, it was very important. So it was a different lifestyle, and it might be very hard to understand from our perspective. So a lot of people at that time would do a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, the place where Jesus was, if they had the resources and the opportunity to do so. No, what was happening to some of these pilgrims was that obviously the Muslims had very little respect for Christians. They were pretty much free game. The Quran and the Hadith was endorsing the slaughter of Christians, and so they very often found themselves going on a pilgrimage, being pious and devout, wanting to see where Jesus lived and where everything took place. And they were captured, put into slavery, murdered. And this news was coming through to the West as well. So something which was considered to be holy and a privilege of Christianity was taken away from them by these guys. And so it became very important to do something about this. So we had two things. We had three things. We had the potential of the Islamic conquest moving into Europe. We had the cry for help from other Christians in the Middle East, and we had the violation of Christians who were guests within the Islamic Empire at the time, wanting to visit Jerusalem and ending up being enslaved or murdered. So there were three things which were quite serious at the time, and they required a response. So what should Europe do? There's a big question. Wait for the conquest to land on their doorstep? So one thing was clear at the time, that the conquest was carrying on and on and on. And Europe could either sit and wait for them to be on their doorstep, or they could start confronting them, preferably not on Europe's turf, but on the Islamic turf, on the Muslim turf, as they were moving further west. What else should they do? Should they ignore the pleas of their Christian brothers in the East for help and protection? Is this the right thing to do? People ask for help and you deny to them. Carry on betraying Christians in the Middle East who were relegated to third-class citizens, enslaved, humiliated and slaughtered? I mean, that's what's been going on for about 400 years, that nobody did anything about it. Yeah? We had North Africa, we had the Middle East, we had a very high percentage of the population. We're looking probably at figures going up to 80% and higher, calling themselves Christians, whether they were real, born-again, Bible-believing Christians, or they were just traditional Christians, is a different question. But there were about 80-90% of the population within that area would consider themselves to be Christians. And they were now, a sword was put to their necks, and they could decide to either become a Muslim or to stay Christian. Even though Christianity doesn't define itself as a political force, and doesn't sanction warfare from a biblical perspective, the medieval mindset did join political, cultural, religious life together, and the world would see a need to warfare, and the medieval mindset would see a need to warfare to defend their freedom and faith. Now, this is very difficult to understand for the modern man who embraces secularism. Yeah. And in secularism, you think, why should I fight for religion? And the problem is we take freedom of thought and freedom of religion for granted. And freedom of religion in the Islamic world is only freedom to convert to Islam. That's all. Yeah. If you're lucky, they let you live if you are a Christian or a Jew. If you are a Hindu or anything else, you won't have a chance of survival. They'll just kill you. And that's pretty much what the Quran and what the Hadith preach and say. So never be fooled. Don't be fooled. What ISIS is doing at the moment is pretty much what the book says. And again, it's a different subject and it doesn't fit into here. But people were fighting for their freedom at the time. The secular mindset would probably say, yeah, we need to fight for democracy, we need to fight for pluralism and things like that. Obviously not for religion, and religion is considered to be something dirty and unattractive. And nevertheless, medieval society was different. God was the most important thing in their lives, the most important subject in their lives. Everything, the whole medieval mindset turned around God, whereas today the whole modern mindset turns around man himself, about man realizing himself, fulfilling himself. So there's a huge difference, and this makes it sometimes very different to understand what was going on in those days and what was going on today. I know that the medieval men, if they could look in the future and they see what wars were fought about today, I mean, they would just be absolutely horrified. Why do we fight wars? There's one tyrant against another tyrant, and one needs to be protected against the other. I just need to remind you of some of the wars in the Middle East, which, like the Kuwait War, there was one dictator who had taken something away from another dictator. The whole world got up in arms and went down, and at high cost of human life and equipment and everything else, the situation was reversed and the dictator was given back the land he had. And then you think, stop, wait, what's going on here? Is this democracy? Is this real? Are we? I mean, obviously, Kuwait was freed.
why didn't we just force the guy who was running it to introduce democracy, if democracy is so valuable? Like a few years later, Iraq was done again, and they introduced democracy in a country which wasn't really ready for it, and we, the West, I would say, gets we see later. Now, the medieval mindset would, or the medieval observer would be horrified by what was going on, that there are wars fought. I mean, the obvious thing is, whatever happened in Kuwait was about oil. It was about the securing the corporate interests of some organizations and the lifestyles of people in the West. And that's really what, if you analyze what was going on there, what it came down to. And that's what it's all about. Yeah, I mean, it's quite horrendous when you look at that. Or we've got the whole thing about an economic system, capitalism versus socialism. I mean, obviously, one gave you the freedom to believe and to believe in what you wanted. The other one enforced atheism on its people, on its population. But as far as an economic system is concerned, I mean, people in both hemispheres, the East and the West, they were pretty much screwed. If you were poor, you were poor. You wouldn't earn a lot of money. You could just have enough to eat and live, and that was pretty much the same whether you lived in the Eastern Hemisphere or the Western Hemisphere. Anyway, just making a point here, and getting a point across that today we think differently, and we've got a different philosophy, most of us have. And medieval man had a different idea as well, and what was important to him was his relationship with God. And that was what was happening in everyday life. Now, this was threatened by the guys from the East. And what should they do? That's a big question. What should they do? Should they just let him come and, take over Europe? And the answer is obviously no. It wasn't possible, and it couldn't be done. What was the ambition for Europeans to join the Crusades? Number one, it was to protect their identity. It was to stop a conquest which were threatening their faith, and it was heading to Europe. It was to help Christians in the East who were besieged. It was to defend ancient Eastern European culture from being Arabized. And it was about defending the holy sites, which to them were very important. And probably the need wouldn't have been there if they had been treated with a bit more respect from the side of the Muslims, including the pilgrims, if they were left alone. Today we fight for dictators, or dictators fight against one another, so many wars are just down to personal ambitions. Second World War was a typical example where there were some ideas, some strange ideas, and there was a personal ambition, and then you had the big loggerhead between Stalin and Hitler. And it was all about big personalities just doing their thing and creating their little empires. We fight about economic systems, which one is better, which one is worse, and then sometimes there's retaliation, which is the recent war. And I would imagine whatever happened recently in America, that some of the stuff was just retaliatory rather than settling some score. It was about settling scores rather than doing anything else, including protecting the nation. Who knows? To sum it up, most wars are mostly about personal ambition of tyrants, of economic interests, of corporations. So we've got tyrants and corporations, and very often wars are fought around those two groups. Unfortunately, innocent people get tied into this. I don't want to know how many people died in the last wars on both sides, not just and then the next thing is, I don't want to know how many people had nothing to do with it. I mean, when we look at the recent Ukraine war, there's a very high fatality on civilians. Most civilians just want to carry on living. They're not interested whether they're part of Russia or they're part of the Ukraine. They just want to live. And yet they are the ones who seem to take the brunt of the war by dying, directly or indirectly through the war efforts. So, in conclusion, it can be said that the Crusades were a defensive war, or the Crusades were defensive wars, and it managed to obstruct the onslaught on Europeans and delay further Islamic conquest in Europe for a few hundred years. So if you look at 1080, when the first Crusade started, the next Islamic onslaught on Europe, the siege of Vienna, which was right in the heart of Europe, was almost 500 years, or 450 years later. So we could say there was a good 400 years where the Islamic conquest in Europe was delayed by and held back. If it hadn't been for that war, there's a good chance that the Islamic conquest would have just carried on, and Europe would have been forcefully Islamized. Maybe we would have held out like the Spanish and not cave into them. I don't know, but it would have been a different situation when the armies are on your doorstep rather than when they are still outside the empire. Okay, in conclusion, it can be said that the Crusades were defensive, yeah, and they managed to obstruct the onslaught of Europeans and delay further Islamic conquest in Europe for a few hundred years. The cause for the Crusades was justified, it's my opinion. I think it had to be done. If it hadn't been done, there would have been, the table would have been turned round on the Europeans, and we would have had to fight them in our land. Still, some excesses of the war on the side of the Crusader armies was dubious. I read some of the stories. I was interested in the Templars to see what they were getting up to. And when you read some of the stories of what was happening in the war, it was absolutely horrendous. Sort of execution of prisoners of war and so on. From today's perspective, even more so than within the context of its time. So it's quite quite horrendous and horrific, which happened there. But I think today it's called collateral damage or something. But nevertheless, even collateral damage is not right. Especially when rules are broken and when innocent people die needlessly, or when people who surrender are murdered. It's not right, and that was what's happening on the Christian side as well as on the Islamic side. So there's stories from both sides coming on. So we need to bear this in mind. So it's not just the evil Christians who came there and they went encroached on Islamic land. It's the other way around. The Islamic conquest encroached on Christian lands, and we as the Christian community had the right to defend our brothers and to protect them from something they didn't want. They did not want Islam. They did not invite Islam. They had no interest in it. Neither did Europe have any interest in Islam. Muslims seem to think that it's okay to kill and conquer on behalf of their prophet, so the conquest of Islam is perfectly justified. In the end, that's what he said, and that's what had to be done. But when we defend ourselves, and when we try to maintain status quo and to ensure the freedom we have to follow Christ, that is considered to be evil and unacceptable on the sides of the Muslims. And is it? I don't think so. I think Europe had the right to defend itself. We were called to help our brothers in the East, Christian brothers in the East, and that's an historic fact. That's some of the documents which have been dug up. The call was answered. A war took place, including all the fallacies of war, which is unfortunate. And but to apologize for the Crusades, there's no way. The Crusades were justified, and they should have happened, and they needed to happen. Otherwise, we would be sitting in the shadow of minarets today in Europe, which slowly seems to be the case anyway. But we could hold the minarets for a good, if you look at today, for a good 800 years to turn up in Europe. For once in that time, Europe was genuinely united. So you had French, British, German armies, you had Italian armies, you had armies from all over Europe joining together and fighting the threat from the east. Europe said no thanks to the Prophet of Medina, and Europe gladly accepted the risk of eternal damnation by not trusting in probably the most bloodthirsty prophet in the history of mankind. And I'm not just talking about what's happened after his death when the conquest took place, but when you look at his lifetime, read the hadith, look at the number of people who died during his time and the death which were condoned by the Prophet from Medina. There's an awful lot. In the Arabic mindset is perfectly okay. I don't know. I prefer my Messiah, who instead of killing people, raised them from the dead. That's the difference between Jesus and Muhammad. Jesus preached love, not murder. Even though he preached judgment as well for those who do not accept his message. Muhammad did the same, but he didn't call his disciples to kill those who do not accept the message. All he said is, walk away from them, shake the dust off your feet as a witness and testimony against them, and leave it at that. Yeah. And that is a Christian ethos. We have got a message, we're going to preach it to you, and maybe you are Muslim and you are quite incensed by what I'm saying here. We are not coming with a sword to you. We are just telling you, Jesus has come, he died for you, he is God become flesh. He laid his life down for you, just because out of love for you. And you can accept it or you can reject it. If you reject it, we won't go after you and kill you. But that's not our job. That's God's job. One day you'll stand before God, and then you have to give answer what you did with his message of the cross, that Jesus died for you, that he has given and provided a way of forgiveness by providing the perfect sacrifice. And if you are Muslim, this is one thing you will understand: the sacrifice, the shedding of innocent blood for your sins. You still do it today when you slaughter your sheep before you eat them, and you have a little prayer to make the sheep halal. That's what Jesus did once and for all. Your sheep is not going to save you, and it's not going to, be there for any forgiveness of sins. But Jesus Christ was a perfect sacrifice, and if you accept what he has done, your sins are relinquished, and you will be set free. It's up to you. It's your choice. We are not forcing you, but we don't want you to force us either. We want to stay with our God, and we have decided to live and to die for the freedom to follow Christ. It was for the love of the true God, for Christianity, for our Christian brothers and sisters in the East, for the love of their families as well, for their nations and for future generations, that many Europeans gave up their wealth, their lives, to protect and to fight for what they treasured most. They laid down their lives for your freedom to follow Christ. There's let me just get this. There's a more in-depth essay on seismicradio.org. So if you go to the resources tab and you scroll down, there is this link to this article, so you can read it yourself again. And there is also a link by a professor called, an essay by a professor called Thomas Madden from St. Louis in the States. And he's an expert in this period of history. And he wrote an alternative view on what was happening with the Crusades. I would like to encourage you, regardless of whether you are a Muslim or a Christian, to really go into this. Also, study it from both sides. Look at some of the Islamic literature on this era, but also look at some of the Christian literature from all sides. The Orthodox, like what was happening in Constantinople, as well as from obviously at the time what was coming from the Vatican. It is a very emotive period. And obviously I don't want to upset anybody with this talk. I just want to set the record straight to a certain extent, because one thing which has happened in recent years is, Muslims are shouting really loud about this issue, and Christians just say, oh yeah, this was wrong, really sorry, we don't want to do this. And it's just a spineless response. It wasn't wrong, it was a defense. If we wanted to defend our culture, if we wanted to defend Europe, and obviously we had later the great periods of the Reformation and other things which came a few hundred years after the Crusades finished, then the only way to maintain status quo in Europe and to have the freedom to follow Christ and to study the scriptures, the Bible, was by opposing this conquest as it was taking place, and not just staying silent. 2/3 of Christianity at the time had been subjugated to Islam. And they were majorities, they weren't minorities, but they were majorities of people who were pursuing Christianity. And that was okay, according to the Muslim hordes and according to modern Islamic scholars. That's perfectly acceptable. But to defend ourselves and to stop them from hitting Europe, that's not acceptable. That's really wrong. That's a message we get. All I have to say is, I'm sorry, it's not wrong. We did the right thing. We had to do it. And I hope, should it happen again, that we will, as it looks like. I mean, I don't know how successful these guys are going to be in Syria. I hope they won't. But unfortunately, and this is maybe a last warning, I'm going to finish on this note. I hope that we would stand up to fight them. America at the moment is not standing up to fight them. The message which is coming through, no ground forces to protect Christians. I think the answer why this is taking place is pretty obvious, as I mentioned before. But one thing, and this is a warning to Europe as well, Europe has fallen away from the values and the ethics it had for many, many years. Europe was a Christian continent for many, many years, and it's fallen away, it's given up. And Jesus prophesied about this. He said, before he comes back, there'll be the great falling away. People just are not bothered, they're not interested. That's what he said. And my warning to you, Europe, is, and maybe to America too, now that America is not quite as bad and quite as extreme as it is in Europe, that if you don't return to God, if you don't return to your roots, to the God of your ancestors, to Jesus Christ, that you are making yourself very vulnerable. That you shouldn't be surprised when one day you'll have the Islamic hordes in London and Berlin and in other places. Christianity is a very benevolent religion. We don't kill people, we don't murder them, we don't use the sword to persuade people. We use love and the Spirit of God to persuade people of the truth in Jesus Christ. That is the way we function. We don't kill people, we don't murder people in order to convert them to Christianity. That's not what we do. These guys do it. And you can see this in Syria all the time. What they are doing is actually scriptural, according to their books. And Europe, you shouldn't be surprised if one day in your capitals you've got these groups standing there, beheading people in the squares of Paris and Berlin, and to force you to adopt their faith. I'm sure you're going to do it wholeheartedly if you know that those sots are killing you if you don't do it. Okay, I shall leave on this note. That's a little message. Europe, turn back to Christ. If you don't turn back to Christ, don't be surprised if judgment is going to hit you right in the heart of where you are. And if you are forced to follow a religion you don't want and you don't like and you never wanted to follow. Nevertheless, and this is a credit to those guys who gave up everything to follow the Crusades, who gave up their wealth, their families, who gave up their lives for the sake of Christ and for the sake of their nations, to protect them from this onslaught. Guys, you've done a good job. At least for a good 800 years, Europe was free. Seems to be a different story now. Europe has given up God, has embraced secularism, and is now on the fast way downhill, getting ready for God's judgment to be executed upon Europe. And who knows, maybe some parts of America as well. I don't know which way America is going. My American friends over there, I hope you will not go the way of Europe and you will stick to the gospel and to the message of the gospel. I know there are great movements in Brazil where many people are turning to Christ right, left and center. I know the United States, there have been many movements about people turning to Christ. It's going the other way now. Canada as well. So there's good news about America. I would like to encourage you to really stick with this and to be strong in God. And my opinion, my firm opinion is, if you are standing tight and you are standing strong on the Word of God and you surrender your nation to God in prayer, you will be protected and you don't have to fear anything from these guys. Okay, God bless, and give us some comments. I'm sure there are going to be a lot of hate comments, but that's okay. That's okay. In the end, it's a debate. I'm sure I'm not getting everything right. There's no question about that. I'm not perfect. I've got a view. My view certainly is it's not objective, but then again, I would say to anybody here on earth that nobody's got an objective view. The only objective view is God's view, and I think that's probably the lowest common denominator I can agree with any Muslim who is listening to this talk, that God's view is perfect and all our views are slightly moved one way or the other. Anyway, God bless, and thank you for watching this talk. Finally, if you want to check out, I would really encourage you to, I'm just going to scroll down here, by Professor Thomas Madden. The talk or the essay you can find at seismicradio.org. Go to the resources section, scroll down, I think I've got it here, Seismic Radio. This is Seismic Radio. Right, go to the resources section. I've forgotten I'm on YouTube, so we can do this. I'm going to click on the resources section, and then you see a lot of interesting bits and bobs on the website. And right at the bottom, as you scroll down, it's not there. Let me just press the refresh button. It's just been put on, and there it is. Right at the bottom, if you scroll down, we've got the Crusades, an Act of Love, and you've got an essay here by Professor Madden. So if I click on here, it comes up, and it's a PDF file, and you can sort of read this. It's got about 8-9 pages, and it sort of looks at a lot of historical facts which have been dug out and very often in history have been forgotten. So it's very, very smart. If you're interested in this subject, just go through it and read through it. And even if you're a Muslim, I mean, one thing you need to do really is look at it from both sides. It's not just from your side, where you are told that there was something terrible which was done by the Christians. And I think you would totally agree with that everybody's got a right to defend himself. And I just happen to believe if we are Christians and we don't want to convert to Islam, we've got a right to defend ourselves and not to be subjugated to your religion. And that's Professor Madden down there. Okay, so that's pretty much a point I want to make. By the way, the guy Professor Madden, I'm quite extreme in my view. He's not that extreme. He's very I don't know, almost quite apologetic, but he just provides a different view on this. Okay, so God bless to all our Muslim listeners. Wa alaikum salam. And I hope it's not been too upsetting for you if you're from the other side. And if you are, feel free to comment and to make your points about the terrible things the Christians have done in defending themselves, their people, and their brothers in the Middle East. Okay, God bless. Bye-bye.